literature, but is it still relevant in this day and age of internet, globalization, and Google Maps? In our next session titled A Sense of Place, travel writers Pico, Iyer, Samanth, Subramanian, Akash, Kapur, and William Dalrymple discuss the genre and read from their books. Please welcome the panelists. Thank you.
And then invite you all to make a comment about human talking.
Short, you say 5 to 6 minutes?
Yeah.
That's short.
Should we work in this direction? Starting with Pico and then with Pico.
Okay, and you know what, do you want us to go up there? Or? Yeah.
Tell your own. How long have we got till? Till 3:15. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our annual travel writing session at Jaipur. This has become an annual institution here, and over the last 6 years, I think we've had many of the greatest travel writers in the world at this festival. We've been privileged to showcase talents ranging from Colin Thubron through to Pico Iyer, who's now coming back for more. So very pleased to welcome him back for a second time. Travel writing has a mixed reputation. I think it's fair to say it goes through moments of popularity. There was a huge boom in the 1930s and again in the 1980s. At other times, it languishes and as being thought of as almost a sort of adjunct to the guidebook, the literature of the guidebook. It is, however, one of the most ancient forms of literature in the world. The earliest writings of mankind, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the wanderings of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, the wanderings of the Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata, use the device of a journey, a story, of a passage, to tell essential truths about mankind. Travel writing has its own history, from roots in myth through the early geographers of the Middle Ages, like Ibn Jubayr, Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, giving factual information about areas that people knew little about. It passes through almost all cultures. There are travelogues written in Western Europe, in the Arab world, in Japan, in China, in India, entirely separate traditions which have sprung up independently in different places. You then get the colonial travelogue of the 19th century, which is linked, as in works like Alexander Burns's Travels to Pokhara, with a colonial project. You often have people handing in official intelligence reports at the same time as they're writing their travel book for popular consumption. Then by the 1930s, you have the comic travel writers. When there is no longer anywhere new to discover and present to your readers, travel writers fall back on humor, starting perhaps with Kinglake in the 1840s through Evelyn Waugh, Aldous Huxley, and Robert Byron, one of my favorite travel writers. Then again, something new is happening by, I think, the 1980s and 1990s, by the time you're getting the internet kicking in, when mass travel and individual travel is a possibility. Anyone can take a holiday in Samarkand today if they have the money, if they can get the cash together. What is the role of travel writing then? By this stage, you're having people, I think, looking far more closely into people's lives, the way that people confront modern life. And there is a persistence in travel writing, which seems, I think, to make it still relevant in an age when you can log on to the internet and look at Google Maps or Google Earth and find your way virtually down any street in the world almost. Well, we have 4 very distinguished travel writers on the platform today, and what I'm going to invite them to do is to talk a little bit about their approach to travel writing, how they create a sense of place, and maybe give a short reading each. We'll start with Pico, work in this direction, and then with Peter Hessler. You can either sit on here or on the podium as you wish. Yeah.
I'm only getting up here because it's very hard to read when sitting down, I think. And after that definitive tour d'horizon, there's nothing I could add, except I don't much enjoy travel writing, reading it or writing it. And I was lucky enough because I grew up traveling quite a bit as a kid. So I've always, I suppose, most been interested in the ways cultures dream about one another, the way they project their longings or their hopes or their terrors on another place. And of course, all of that is happening ever more as cultures converge at increasing speed across the planet. And I suppose for me, place is less interesting in itself than as a gateway to confronting maybe some of the emotional or moral, psychological issues that you would never face at home. In other words, in travel, you're suddenly confronted by a kid walking down the street in Bombay, hand extended. What do? You can't run away from it, but what is the right thing to do in that response? At home, you can sleepwalk through your days, but in travel, you have at every moment to confront these questions. So Willie had asked me to read for 5 minutes. I will. And given what he was just saying about travel writing in the 1930s, I thought it's a good idea to read something very humorous. And therefore, I chose the most humorless piece I could find. There's nothing funny about this, and it's politically incorrect as well. But if any of you are moved to walk out, you're going to miss the other 4, so you may not want to. And it's from my most recent book about Graham Greene. I was in Saigon one autumn and had just checked into the Hotel Majestic along the Saigon River. It was midnight, which meant 10 in the morning in California, where I'd woken up, and the day for me was just beginning. I walked along Dong Khoi Street towards the Hotel Continental, a central site in Greene's novel, The Quiet American, and as I did so, I wondered how much places or people ever really change. They adopt new fashions with the seasons, lose hair, or see crow's feet gather around their eyes, yet the girl who was once 9 years old is still visible in the grandmother of 84. Dong Khoi, or Simultaneous Uprising Street, was alive with the somewhat illicit energy I remembered from an earlier trip 13 years before. The sound of Layla drifted up from an underground bar, and when I looked in on another 60s-themed place, the Jefferson Airplane, were playing White Rabbit, I saw Japanese couples shyly sipping at Lynchburg lemonades and Girl Scout cookies. Men in the shadows whispered promises of exotic pleasures, and cyclo drivers pedaled slowly past, sometimes with a young woman in their throne, sometimes stopping to ask me if I wanted a friend for the night. As I made my way down the street, massage, massage, murmured the men who were standing around. A young woman on a motorbike suddenly veered in front of me, stopped, and taking off her helmet, shook free her long hair. "We go my room?" she asked. The French War, the American War, the war against the Khmer Rouge had all come and gone, yet Saigon seemed not so different from what Greene had seen in 1951. Alive with adrenaline energy and the excitement of arrival, free at last after 20 hours in a plane, I stepped into an internet cafe to try to catch the scene while it was still alive within me. "It's eerie," I wrote to a friend who'd grown up in the same neighborhood as I when I was 6 years old in Oxford. Fong and Fowler from The Quiet American, they're all around me. I can almost imagine Greene, raincoat buttoned tightly about his throat, slipping round the next corner. It's like stepping into his Vietnam novel. As I tapped away at my excited account, trying to inhale the smells and ironies to send across the waters to England or New Mexico or wherever my friend happened to be, a woman slipped in from the New York Saigon bar next door. Greene would never have called her a woman. She was a girl, as confounding as any of her cousins who attached themselves to foreign males abroad. With a beauty queen face and a tigress air to her, and I was sure a keen head for numbers. She was tiny and wearing high heels, and her legs were long and shapely. Business must be slow in the New York Saigon today, I thought, as she perched herself on one of the tall stools in front of a terminal and began logging on to her Hotmail account. If you have a dangerous curiosity about the world, or if you're just a writer of sorts trained to collect observations, you become, in such situations, shameless. There's a splinter of ice, Greene wrote in his memoir, in the heart of a writer, and he needs that sense of cool remove to do his job, as any diagnostician does. I looked over while deep in my message to see what the young lady was responding to. It was, of course, a love letter from an admirer now in Germany. "Dear Fong," it began, and the immemorial cadences of half-requited love tumbled out. "You know, I could almost imagine my friend Henry saying, 'Greene stayed in the Majestic too.' I hadn't known. That was where he met the young woman he turned into Fong." Well, of course, Greene might have said, if presented with such evidence, a writer's job is to see what will happen to a stranger tomorrow. he has to plunge so deeply into the recesses of his consciousness that he touches off tremors that find an echo in a reader. And if he goes deep enough into the subconscious, he will find the future hidden there as much as the past. A writer is a palmist reading the lines of the planet. 10 years before American involvement in Vietnam was reaching its peak, Green was already writing about napalm bombing and describing CIA intrigue there and fumbled attempts to make contact with local proxies. The whole of The Quiet American could be taken as a questioning of men's efforts to rescue a world much larger than their ideas. God save us always from the innocent and the good, Fowler says early on, with typical if slightly showy Greenian irony. Half a novel later, he tells The Quiet American, I wish sometimes you had a few bad motives. You might understand a little more about human beings. I look back at the real Fong now, typing out an answer to her faraway suitor in Europe. I think about you all the time. I knew she'd write, though misspelling a few of the words. I miss you. When you come back, Saigon. Then she noticed I was spying on her and gave me a long, slow smile, an invitation. I could be her Fowler tonight, she might have been saying, or her pile. A watchful, English-born journalist, or a naive young graduate from the New World, so eager to save her and her country that he seemed certain to ensure the destruction of them both. Thank you.
Thank you, Pico. Next up, we have Samanth Subramanian. Samanth is the India correspondent of The National and author of Following Fish, travels around the Indian coast, which won the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize last year, and is currently working on a book about the Sri Lankan Civil War.
Thank you. Just to quickly answer a question that William raised about the nature of travel writing today, I think the age of the internet has made it possible for everybody to, first of all, find out how to get to a place, to see how a place looks with photos and videos. And very often the place has come to you just because of the nature of globalization today. So it's incumbent, it becomes incumbent upon the travel writer to, in my opinion, at least do two things. The first is to become really granular about the things that you report, and especially about the people who you talk to, because that's the kind of thing that can never be communicated over an internet blog post or a video. And the second thing, and the thing that I think Pico does so well and has been doing so well, is to prize the inner self of the narrator, to kind of open up the book to your own, the author's own mind, and let people know what thoughts and opinions and experiences shape themselves depending upon what you see in the external world. I mean, the first you might consider to be sort of almost a journalistic point of view, where you go out and seek the granular. But the second is a very writerly instinct to actually open yourself up to what you see around you and then communicate that to the reader. Having said that, I'll read something that is slightly less serious than Pico's extract. This is from the Kerala chapter in Following Fish. If you ever find yourself on one of Kerala's highways with an hour or 5 to spare, keep your eyes open for a distinctive black and white sign by the side of the road. This sign will bear in its center the single word Kallu in Malayalam, and above it a legend along the lines of TS number 189, the number being subject to change. If a few kilometers go by and you spot no such signs, which in itself would be remarkable, you should flag down the first passing male cyclist or pedestrian and say a single word with a questioning drawl. Sharp. If it is particularly early in the morning, throw in a sheepish smile for good measure. You must note here that the drawl is everything. If you simply say shop, you will get either an indifferent shrug or a vague gesture towards an establishment selling soap, toothbrushes, and packets of potato chips. If, however, you get it right and say sharp, an animated nod is what you will get, followed by detailed directions to the nearest toddy shop. More often than not, you will then drive up to a walled-off compound that includes one little structure, easily identified as a kitchen, another little structure with bicycles parked outside it, and a number of individual little cabanas. There is unfortunately an explicit social code that kicks in at the shop's gate. If you happen to look like a local or a paddy field worker, you will be led towards the common bar area. If you don't, you will be requested equally firmly to take any of the cabanas that are free. Mixing is discouraged. If you insist on proceeding to the common bar, you will get nothing more than a dirty look, but it will be a very dirty look indeed. The more upscale cabanas you will find are furnished with a small ceiling fan, thinly padded benches around a table, an asbestos roof, and chicken wire windows. Curtains are optional. The toddy will be brought to you in either a pitcher or in tall Kingfisher beer bottles with glasses or earthen tumblers on the side. And then, inevitably, you will ask for something to eat with your toddy, and thus wander into a whole new subculture of food. The best toddy that is fresh and untouched by base additives, should taste only marginally less mild than milk, with a slight sweetness, a faint note of ferment, and the occasional granule of coconut husk. When it is collected as sap from the palm tree, the toddy is entirely non-alcoholic, and it is thrown into ferment only when it picks up tiny residues of yeast from the air. Tapped early in the day or late the previous night, it would have barely begun to turn into alcohol. So stories of how in the olden days the wealthy owners of coconut groves would knock back 5 or 6 glasses every morning for their health seem entirely plausible. As much as it sounds like an invitation into dipsomania, the best toddy at a toddy shop is to be had at around 11 o'clock in the morning. By lunchtime, the toddy's sweetness will have begun to fade, and a few hours after that, questionable practices slip into operation. A sharp owner will dump sugar into his toddy to make it more palatable. He will ramp up the kick of the drink, pouring in cheap vodka or dubious arak or country liquor. Some owners, I've been told, powder dried marijuana leaves, tie them into a bundle of thin cotton cloth, and soak the bundles in the toddy. Mahesh Thampi, a friend of mine living in Trivandrum, has heard even more horrifying stories of old batteries dropped into vats of toddy for the acid to mix slowly with the alcohol. You have to remember, he said, most of the people who go to these shops just want to get high as fast as possible and leave. Nobody wants to sit around and drink the good stuff, which is why there's so much bad liquor floating around. So many newspaper headlines of blindness or even death because of illicit alcohol. He told me one fantastic story of sitting in a bar in Trivandrum. Suddenly, he said, there was a power cut and the lights went out. In the silence, one agonized voice cried out, "Oh my God, I've gone blind!" The arak mixed toddy in local parlance is called the Anamayaki, which reassures its drinkers that it is strong enough to addle an elephant. It's all controlled by the liquor mafia here in Kerala, of course, Thampi said. 2 or 3 years ago, somebody calculated that even if every coconut tree in Kerala was tapped, you wouldn't get the volume of toddy that is being served in the state. Trivandrum has its share of liquor plenipotentiaries, including one man who goes by the zippy handle of Yamaha Surendran. Thampi promised he wasn't making that up. Meeting Thampi was my introduction to a world where I was told, work stops for toddy. Thampi is a clean-cut, neatly moustached man who runs a thriving real estate business in Trivandrum. He has an MBA, and he is intelligent and earnest about his work. But on a Monday morning, he was still eager to troop out of town onto the highway in search of a good toddy shop. Indeed, the only person who showed any alarm at all over our agenda was our peach-fuzzed young cabbie, smiling nervously as he examined the prospect of an afternoon of driving drunks around the countryside. Thank you.
Okay, next up, Akash Kapur, who's surprisingly good on stage, as I keep telling you.
Thanks, William.
Is the author of India Becoming, a New Yorker Best Book of 2012, and a Newsweek must-read on modern India. He has written for The Atlantic, The Economist, Granta, The New York Times, Outlook, and The New Yorker. He's the former Letter from India columnist at the International Herald Tribune and the online edition of The New York Times. Akash.
Thank you for that generous introduction, William. The title of this thing is A Sense of Place, and I was thinking about what role place takes in writing, and I was thinking, at least in my writing, place really takes the role of a character. I mean, it has mood, it has texture, it has history, but it's almost like an uber character, because the mood and the texture of place sort of defines the overall mood and the feeling for all the other characters, and sometimes for the book in general. I mean, when I think of some of my favorite travel writing, like Peter Mathiassen's Snow Leopard, what I remember most is the mood of the place, the sort of heartbreaking beauty of the place. So, I mean, I think in a lot of travel writing, there's a tendency sometimes to run through place very quickly and sort of get through it to the stories. But for me, place actually is really one of the most important aspects of any writing. Anyway, this is from This reading is from my book, India Becoming. It's from the first chapter, and the chapter is mostly focused on a sort of middle-aged zamindar in a village in Tamil Nadu who is having to sort of struggle with and accommodate himself to the new India and the changing patterns of meritocracy in his village. And this happens on a November afternoon when he takes me for a walk on his land, on his ancestral fields. Sati's forest land wasn't really a forest at all. It was, in fact, quite barren. Sati said it had once been covered with mango, neem, and palmyra trees. Now all that remained was a thin line of palmyras, their trunks encased in an ancient carapace of spikes, their leaves rustling in the monsoon wind. The forest had been cut down, chopped away one branch at a time by villagers foraging for firewood. It had been reduced to a flat, if wild and beautiful stretch of shrubs and thorn bushes. We lost control of the land, Sati said. Before, no one dared to cut on our property, but when our status went down, I couldn't manage things as well as my father. I couldn't stop the villagers around here from killing our forest. My legs were tired from the walk. I crouched on the ground on the slippery grey clay above a stream. The stream flowed fast and strong. The rains had been heavy. It had been a successful monsoon. Quite a downpour, I said to Sati, and he agreed and said it was good for the farmers. But then he shook his head and said it was nothing compared to some of the rains he remembered. He remembered standing on this land in the pouring rain, his face flat in the gusting wind with his father when he was a boy. They had come to inspect a dam. The rains had been ferocious, the strongest Sati had ever seen. The dam was in danger of breaching. The village could have been flooded. Sati's father gathered more than 500 men. He called, and they came, and they worked in the rain, strengthening the dam with bags of sand and logs from cashew trees. They worked for 3 days under the supervision of his father. They saved the village. Sati told me that story, and he told me how proud he had felt of his father. He had so much control, so much charisma, he said. Everyone obeyed him. Sometimes I wish I could imitate him, but I don't have his looks, and I don't have his charisma. Do you think that the village would have stayed the same if your father was still alive? I asked him. No, I wouldn't say that, Sati said. That's going too far. Even my father couldn't stop modernity. Even he couldn't block what's happening in this country now. Sometimes, to tell you the truth, I think it's good he died. He wouldn't want to see everything that has happened. Sati told me a story about a meeting that took place in the village near the end of his father's life. The meeting was held outdoors under a banyan tree. His father was late. Everyone stood up when he arrived. Everyone except for one man, a Dalit youth named Raju. Raju had spent some time working in the cities. He had fancy, modern ideas. He was defying the Red Iyer. Sati said his father's face turned to stone when he saw Raju sitting. He didn't say anything at the meeting, and he didn't say much the rest of the day. He was silent at dinner. Later, when Sati was massaging his father's feet in the bedroom he shared with his parents, his father looked straight at him and said, "I don't know how you will manage. I don't know how you will cope." Sati told his father not to worry. He said times were changing and the family had to change with them. He said he would learn to adjust. They all had to adjust. Now, Sati told me, when he visited places like Bangalore and Chennai, when he saw what was going on in the cities, he wondered if maybe his father was right. Sometimes I think that maybe I goofed up my life, he said. Why did I stay a farmer? It's silly to be a farmer these days. We landlords missed the Industrial Revolution, and now we're missing the technology revolution. Sometimes I ask myself why I'm struggling to keep the farm running while so many children are making millions. Maybe my father had a point. We didn't know how to cope. He didn't say anything for a while after that. The land, too, was silent. We felt far away from the village, far from the road that was becoming a highway, and farther still from the cities that would be connected by that highway. Dragonflies hovered above the stream. A group of minor birds dug at the ground. A kingfisher exploded in a burst of blue. Sitting there, the stream gurgling below me, the chirp of crickets in the air, and a mongoose pawing nervously at a clump of wild berries, searching maybe for prey, I could just about remember the way my home had felt so many years ago, when I was a boy. Sati's forest land felt untouched. I felt alone, far from the crowds and commotion and constant churning of the nation. I love this land, Sati said. It's that old feeling, something that hasn't been lost. Thanks.
Next up, we have one of the stars of the new travel writing, frequently cited as one of the great hopes for the future of the genre, Peter Hessler, staff writer in The New Yorker, where he served as Beijing correspondent from 2000 to 2007, also contributing writer for National Geographic. He's the author of a trilogy of books about China, highly acclaimed, Rivertown, Oracle Bones, and Country Driving. He's just been posted to Cairo in Egypt, which I'm sure will provide a very leisurely and quiet few years for you over the next period to come.
Yeah, thanks, William. I'm not sure if I'm necessarily a travel writer, and probably all of us feel somewhat to this, somewhat like this. But I've always been inspired by travel writer, and I consider myself to be at least part of a travel writer. And there's some of the things I really like about the genre. First of all, is the tradition of the first-person voice. I'm also described as a journalist and as a foreign correspondent, and that tends to be missing in those forms of writing. And I like the fact that with travel writing, there's a tradition of putting yourself in the story and letting people know how people are reacting to you, how you might be changing the interaction, and more directly letting them know what your impressions are. I think the other thing I like about the genre is something else that William mentioned, that it has a mixed reputation. I kind of like the fact that travel writing doesn't take itself so seriously. And there's a tradition in journalism, particularly in being a foreign correspondent, that you do take yourself very seriously. And I like the fact that travel writing undermines this a bit. I'm going to read today from a piece I wrote that's actually part of my new book, Strange Stones, which comes out this spring. And it's an essay about living in Beijing in a hutong neighborhood. Hutongs in Beijing are old neighborhoods that were basically just mostly being demolished in the 90s and early 2000s. And these are sort of pre-automobile neighborhoods. And in the hutong, there are a couple of things that I wrote about that were very important institutions. One is the public bathroom, and another was the bike repairman, who in our hutong was named Old Yang, was what people called him. And he was always passing on to me information and introducing people to me. And 1 week he told me that he had given my phone number to the local matchmaker, and that she had arranged a date. And Old Yang explained that the date was college educated and 1.63 meters tall. Height is really important in dating in China. And so I told him, I said, I really don't. I'm not looking right now. I don't need to do this, so you can maybe just tell her that I'm not interested. Old Yang gave me a stern look and said it was too late. Everything had already been arranged. He'd look bad if I didn't go. That week, the matchmaker called me 4 times. She introduced herself as Peng Laoshi, Teacher Peng, and she had scheduled the date for Saturday afternoon. We met at a McDonald's just outside of the hutong. My date was supposed to arrive in a few minutes, but there was something that Teacher Peng wanted to clarify first. This is an underground meeting, she said, after we'd found seats in an upstairs section of the restaurant. Why? I asked. It's not official, she said. We're not allowed to work with foreigners. Why not? The government doesn't want us to, she said. They're afraid the foreigners will trick Chinese women. There was a pause, from which point the conversation could have proceeded in any number of interesting directions. But Teacher Peng seemed accustomed to filling awkward silences. Of course, I'm not worried about you, she said, beaming and speaking fast. Old Yang says you're a good person. When I had first moved to the neighborhood, I had regarded the McDonald's as an eyesore and a threat. It was a sign of the economic boom that had already destroyed most of old Beijing. Over time, though, hutong life gave me a new perspective on the franchise. For one thing, it's not necessary to eat fast food in order to benefit from everything that McDonald's has to offer. At the local restaurant, it's common to see people sitting at tables without ordering anything. Invariably, many are reading. In the afternoon, school children do their homework. I've seen the managers of neighboring businesses sitting quietly, balancing their account books. And always, 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 somebody is sleeping. McDonald's is the opposite of hutong life in ways both good and bad. It's cool in summer and warm in winter, and there are private bathrooms. It's also anonymous. Unlike Chinese restaurants where waitresses hover, the staff at a fast food joint leaves people alone. On a number of occasions, dissidents have asked me to meet them at a McDonald's or a KFC because it's safe. When Teacher Peng told me that our meeting was underground, I realized why she had chosen the restaurant. Others apparently had the same idea. One couple sat near the window, leaning close and whispering. At another table, 2 well-dressed girls seemed to be waiting for their dates. Over Teacher Peng's left shoulder, I kept an eye on a couple who appeared to be having some sort of crisis. The woman was about 25. The man seemed older, in his 40s. Their faces shone with the unnatural redness that comes to many Chinese who have been drinking. They sat in silence, glaring at each other. Nearby, the McDonald's playland was deserted. Teacher Peng's pager went off. That's her, she said, and asked to borrow my cell phone. I'm at McDonald's, she said into the phone. The Italian is already here. Hurry up. After Teacher Peng hung up, I tried to say something, but she spoke too fast. She teaches music at a middle school, she said. She's a very good person. I wouldn't introduce you otherwise. Good. Listen, she's 24 years old. She's pretty, and she's 1.64 meters tall. She's educated. She's thin, though. I hope that's not a problem. She's not as voluptuous as the women in Italy. There was so much to process. For one thing, my date seemed to be growing taller. But before I could speak, Teacher Peng rattled on. Good. Listen, you have a good job and you speak Chinese. Also, you were a teacher before, so you have something in common with her. Finally, she stopped to breathe. I said, I'm not Italian. What? I'm American. I'm not Italian. Why did old Yang tell me you're Italian? I don't know, I said. My grandmother's Italian, but I don't think old Yang knows that. Now Teacher Peng looked completely confused. America is an immigrant country, I began, and then I decided to leave it at that. She recovered her poise. That's fine, she said with a smile. America's a good country. It's fine that you come from America. My date arrived wearing headphones. A Japanese script decorated her stylish jacket, and she wore tight jeans. Her hair had been dyed a dark brown. Teacher Peng introduced us and tactfully took her leave. Very slowly, one by one, the woman removed her headphones. She looked quite young. The CD player sat on the table between us. I asked if she wanted anything from the restaurant, and she shook her head. I respected that. Why spoil a date at McDonald's by eating the food? She told me that she lived with her parents in a hutong near the bell tower. Her school was nearby. While she was talking, I glanced at the drunk couple behind her. Now they were ignoring each other, and the woman flipped angrily through a newspaper. The music teacher said, "Do you live near here?" "I live in Juro Hutong," I said. "I didn't know there were foreigners there," she said. "How much is your rent?" This being China, I told her. "That's a lot," she said. "Why do you pay so much?" "I don't know. I guess they can always charge foreigners more." "You were a teacher, right?" I told her that I used to teach English in a small city in Sichuan province. "That must have been boring," she said. "Where do you work now?" I said that I was a writer who worked at home. "That sounds even more boring," she said. I'd go nuts if I had to work at home. The drunk couple began arguing loudly. Suddenly the woman stood up, brandished the newspaper, and smacked the man on the head. Then she spun on her heel and stormed out past Playland. Without a word, the man folded his arms, lay his head down on the table, and went to sleep. The music teacher looked up at me and said, "Do you often go back to Italy?" The following week, the matchmaker telephoned to see if there was any chance of a second meeting, but she wasn't insistent. She impressed me as a sharp woman, sharp enough to recognize that my cluelessness might be exploited in better ways than dates at McDonald's. The next time I ran into her in the hutong, she asked if I wanted to become an investor in a karaoke parlor. After that, I avoided walking past her office. When I asked old Yang about the confusion, he shrugged and said that I once mentioned that my grandmother is of Italian descent. I had no memory of the conversation, but I picked up a valuable hutong lesson. Never underestimate how much the bike repairman knows.
To round this up, and before we throw it open to questions, I'll just read a very brief passage from the only book I've written which has nothing at all to do with India or South Asia, and the book that, as a result, never gets read here. So this is a sad attempt to try and sell a few more copies of my least popular book. This is a book called From the Holy Mountain, which is about a journey I did in 2003 to 4, following the ancient Christian communities of the Middle East. People today tend to think of the Middle East as being a solidly Islamic bloc, but it was once the homeland of Christianity, and people forget that Christianity in its origins is as much an Eastern religion as Judaism and Islam. The route I followed was to follow an extraordinary travel writer from the 6th century, a Byzantine monk called John Moschus, who was an almost direct contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. And while he was circling the monasteries of what's now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt, Islam was being born in the Hejaz. And so the picture that John Moschus records is a last snapshot of a Christian Middle East, a landscape populated with monks, these strange stylites, these men standing on pillars as a form of asceticism, the dendrites, who took literally Christ's instruction to behave like the birds of the air, and so lived in trees and built little nests for themselves in the branches. And also a sort of gentleman a man called Baradatus he writes about, who's a sort of Byzantine boil-in-the-bag monk who sewed himself up in animal skins in order to sort of be broiled alive as a deliberate form of self-penance. The point of this journey was to see what had happened to these Christian communities in the intervening period. And time and time again, it was a similar picture of decline, emigration, particularly accelerated in the late 19th century and early parts of the 20th century. But over and again, I found that whenever I actually got to one of the monasteries where Moscas stayed, the monastery was still there. And over time and time again, one would arrive at a gatehouse somewhere in some remote part, whether it was the West Bank or in eastern Turkey or in a valley in Lebanon, knock on the door, and suddenly one would enter a fragment of the old Byzantine Empire. There would be monks sitting in the choir stalls, roosting in the choir stalls in their black robes, singing the liturgy in the language of 5th century Byzantium, so that the lifeline of tones and syllables in their plain chant acted like a kind of connection, a lifeline thrown to the 5th century, to this lost world of John Moscas. And perhaps the place in the journey I felt it most strongly of all was visiting a very remote monastery on the West Bank, just above the Dead Sea, surrounded by quite radical Hamas villages, where there's this little outpost of Greek monasticism. And the monastery of Marsaba was one of the great intellectual centers of the early Middle Ages. Many of the great Sanskrit manuscripts coming out of India found their way to Marsaba, where they got translated into more familiar forms into Greek and made their way hence into Western Europe. So, for example, the life of the Buddha gets transformed via a translation in Marsaba into the story of Balaam and Josaphat, which became a very famous cautionary series of sort of moral tales, much enjoyed in the early Middle Ages in Europe. And I'm just going to read now from my first evening in Marsaba. "Look at it," said Father Theophanes, the monastery's tall, gaunt guestmaster, waving a hand at the dark, rocky gorge beneath us. "There it is," he said, "there it is, the valley of doom, the valley of dreadful judgment. Below us, the monastic buildings of Marsaba fell away in a ripple of chapels, cells, and oratories, each successive layer hanging like a wasp's nest from a ledge on the rock face. Opposite, the top of the cliff wall had turned an almost unnatural shade of red in the last of the evening light. The rock was pitted with caves, each formerly the cell of a Byzantine monk. All were now deserted." "It's very beautiful," I said. "Beautiful?" said Father Theophanes, rustling his robes in horror. "Beautiful? See down there at the bottom, the river. Nowadays it's just sewage from Jerusalem. But on Judgment Day, that is where the river of blood is going to flow. It's going to be full of Freemasons, whores and heretics, Protestant schismatics, Jews and Catholics. More ouzo? Please." He poured a little thimbleful of spirit into a small glass. When I gulped it down, he continued with his apocalypse. "At the head of the damned will be a troop composed of all the popes of Rome, followed by their deputies, the vice presidents of the Freemasons." "You're saying the Pope's a Freemason?" "A Freemason? Everyone knows that the Pope is a Freemason. Each morning he worships the devil in the form of a naked woman with the head of a goat." "Actually," I said, "I'm a Catholic." "Then," said Father Theophanes, "unless you convert to orthodoxy, you too will follow your Pope down that valley through the scorching fire. We will watch you from this balcony," he added. "But of course by then it'll be too late to save you." I smiled, but Father Theophanes was in full swing and clearly in no mood for joking. "No one can know truly what that day will be like," he continued gravely. "But some of our Orthodox fathers have had visions Fire. Fire that will never end. Terrible, terrible fire will come from the throne of Christ, just like it does on the icons. The saints, those who are to be saved, in other words, the Orthodox Church, will fly through the air to meet Christ. But sinners and all non-Orthodox will be prodded, will be separated from the elect. They will be pushed and prodded by devils down through the fire, down the valley of Josaphat, past Jericho, exactly the route those Israeli hikers took 10 minutes ago, down to the mouth of hell. Is that nearby? I asked. Certainly, said Father Theophanes, stroking his beard, the mouth of hell will open up near the Dead Sea. That's in the Bible. Of course, said Father Theophanes. Everything I'm telling you is true. Anyway, we carried on like this for a week. And it was only at the end, just as I was leaving, that I plucked up the courage to ask Father Theophanes why he was so upset about the Freemasons. I said, I don't understand this thing about the Freemasons. I thought these days, you know, they just did bridge evenings and whist drives and that sort of thing. Why are you so worried about them? He said, because they are the legions of the Antichrist, the stormtroopers of the whore of Babylon. But, you know, I just thought they just had coffee mornings these days. Coffee mornings, said Father Theophanes, pronouncing the word as if it was some sort of satanic ritual. Probably this coffee morning also. But their main activity, he said, is to worship the devil. There are many steps, he said, nodding knowingly. But the final step is to meet with the devil and have homosexual relations with him. After this, he makes you Pope, or sometimes President of the United States. President? Certainly, he said, this has been proved. This has been proved. All the presidents of the United States have been Freemasons, except Kennedy. And you know what happened to him. So, questions do you have about Freemasons? About picking up girls in China or in Hanoi? Ask away. We have 10 minutes.
I just want to share an experience of not looking for liquor in Kerala with Samanth. I was at the Cochin.
That's a very unusual situation to be in.
I was at the Cochin airport and I travel a lot, and a Snickers bar is my travel food. So I went to the counter and I said, "You have Snickers or something?" So then he kind of looked so shocked and said, "No, madam, you will not get anything like liquor here."
Next up. The microphone over here.
I've always wondered with travel writing whether it's necessary to leave some things out that people tell you in terms of confidentiality. You know, if you're like Colin Thubron's book, Lost Heart of Asia, where he's talking with these Russian people who are, you know, alcoholics, and he's sort of telling it how it is in their family. I wonder whether they'd like to read that one day, and whether it's necessary as a travel writer to sort of pull your punches a bit, and change names, or do you just tell it exactly how it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, obviously you don't want to get anybody in trouble, and there are occasionally situations. China is a place where you can get people in trouble, although this was more true in the past. It's become more open recently. But in my first book, I changed names. I didn't change anything else. And you do leave things out. I mean, I was close friends with somebody in the town I lived in. I wrote my first book. It was called Rivertown, and about this town fooling, this small place in Sichuan province. And I was good friends with this guy, and he worked at a factory, and there was a lot of factories in that area that had been set up for defense industry back when Mao was worried about nuclear attack from the US. They moved a lot of stuff from Shanghai into very remote places, and so some of it was from this. And he worked at one of these factories, and he said, you know, they used to be involved in nuclear-ish stuff and weaponry, but now it's a boat factory. So one day he wanted to take me there. He's like, is it okay? You know, is it okay if we? Oh, yeah, sure. So he you know, we go there and we start to have some tea in his office, and his boss comes in just furious, you know, and what's the foreigner doing here, and you've got to get out of here, and kicked us out. And my friend was very sheepish, and then on the way back he said, well, you know, and actually we still do some nuclear stuff here anyway, so that, but you know, so I didn't put that in the book. I mean, there's some things like that, but I think on the whole, and especially as China has progressed, you can be pretty open. In my last book, I didn't change any names or any other details.
Pico.
In my first book, I was describing a trishaw driver I met in Burma, and Burma is famously charged with intelligence and spies around every corner. So with great cunning and inventiveness, I changed his name from Nong Nong to Mong Mong. He's so delighted to appear in the book that he's now rebranded himself and calls himself Mong Mong. And if you go to Mandalay, you can still find him on 68th Street, presenting you with a page from my book and saying, I'm Mong Mong.
Akash.
I think, you know, as a writer, I get to know my characters pretty well, and in fact live pretty close to some of them, and so I always feel like a very strong sense of responsibility to protect them, and sometimes that can get weird because sometimes they can be naive and want you to include information that you know is going to get them into trouble. So I had like a gay character in the book who hadn't come out to his family, and he kept wanting me to sort of include his real name and everything, and I didn't do it. And now, you know, he came to me and thanked me for that because, in fact, like, he realized that this book was going to be very public and would have been a very difficult situation. And you can also have the opposite happen, where as a writer you're overprotective. There was there's one scene in here with a cow broker, and he tells me some very sensitive stuff about his family, and so I changed a lot of identifying information. And then that passage of the book was excerpted in the New Yorker, and I thought, oh God, you know, they're going to call him and fact check it and ask him, like, you know, is it true that your family thinks you're responsible for your son's death, and that kind of stuff, and they're going to, you know, it's going to fall apart and everybody's going to think I'm a liar. And they called him from New York, and they sort of ran through everything with him, and he said, it's all fine, except I want my real name used. So, you know, I mean, these are judgment calls you make as a writer, but I do think it's important to protect your people and your sources.
Patrick Leigh-Fermor, who's one of the travel writers I admire most, who died 2 years ago. Extraordinary writer. A book that's not widely read or known in India called A Time of Gifts. For my money, one of the great pieces of travel writing of the 20th century. He was so horrified by how, when he wrote his first book about Greece, Mani, how immediately sort of casinos and caravan parks opened in all the places he praised and made famous, that he went out of his way to mislead all subsequent travelers in every other one of his books. So if ever you want to find beautiful places and are reading a Patrick Leigh-Fermor book, don't think that, don't follow his maps, don't believe his names or everything. They're deliberately confused. I think, though, there is an important point that while it's very important to be factual, you do have to tailor. The whole art of travel writing, in the sense, is selection. If you put in everything that happens, it's going to be very, very boring. Because most travel is you know, hanging around in bus stations or airports. So you have to select and tailor experience into shape, which doesn't mean you make it up or you obfuscate it, but you just leave in only what's interesting, and you have to be very selective.
My question is a bit of a corollary to what was just asked. When I was briefly a travel writer in Mumbai, all my other journalists used to say, travel writing is mostly fiction. And I was wondering your views on that.
Well, I don't think that's true, for starters, and that's the easiest answer. But I mean, I can understand the perception that exists, in the sense, I think some of us mentioned it earlier, is that travel fiction is probably a lot more writerly than journalism usually is. You craft a narrative, you create characters. Travel writing is a lot more writerly, and because of that, it can sometimes come across as fictional, or as, you know, that, or even, I mean, this, as you say, this goes on the heels of what the previous questioner asked, which is, are you being so selective about what you're presenting, is that it almost comes across as fiction. But the simple answer to that is no. I mean, the best travel writing is almost always factual. Always factual. Not almost always.
Yeah, I mean, I think also this, you know, the genre has broadened and bled into other genres, and most of us here consider ourselves, is doing other things as well. And I consider myself also doing reportage, and basically I'm also inspired by anthropology, and my father's a sociologist, and so the accuracy is very important to me. And I think it's become more. Serious travel writers, I think, are more concerned with accuracy maybe than people were 40 years ago. Same with nonfiction writing. I mean, if you read like Joseph Mitchell in the New Yorker, there were things that were not really accurate. They were in Truman Capote. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, they were basically sort of allowed to stretch things, and you can't do that now because they'll call everybody in the story and ask them about it at the New Yorker, and so the standard, I think, is a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be contentious, but I think how you define genres is almost irrelevant. And actually, to me, travel writing is fiction. V.S. Naipaul's great book, Away in the World, for example, was published on one side of the Atlantic as fiction, and on the other, exactly the same text was presented as non-fiction. When Paul Theroux wrote, I think, some of his most interesting travel books, My Other Life and My Secret History, when excerpts appeared in the New Yorker, they were ambiguously or teasingly characterized as fact and fiction. And I certainly think a lot of the great travel writers are novelists. D.H. Lawrence, John le Carré, Graham Greene, whom I was reading about. So the ones who get deepest into a culture and do exactly what we're trying to aspire to while claiming to be documentary reportagers are actually just saying a novel on the front page.
I'm with Pico in that. I think it depends what you're trying to do. I think no one particularly minds if Bill Bryson, in one of his comic travelogues, stretches a bit of dialogue, but I think if you're doing a serious look at, traveling through the Gulag, or doing a piece of serious reportage that clearly isn't comic, and is clearly meant to be serious, and it is basically reportage, and obviously you apply the same standards as you would in any New Yorker fact-check piece.
But there's certainly a section of travel writing readership that feels sort of let down when, for example, it emerges that some of Bruce Chatwin's
Ryszard Kapuscinski.
Yeah, exactly. These segments are fictionalized. I mean, there's definitely the impression that a large part of the audience that you're writing for is looking at this as a documentary form, whether or not the writer himself or herself looks at it as a more sort of writerly fictionalized.
In defense of Chatwin, he famously won the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award for the songlines. And he sent it back saying it was a novel. And he didn't take the money. He sent the check back.
I think the most important thing is to let the reader know, basically. And I mean, I've always, in the very beginning of a book, would tell if there's been names changed or not. And I think that, for example, Paul Theroux's books, which I think are those two books that Pico mentioned, are really phenomenal books. But he's very explicit. There's a note in the beginning that says, this is not strictly true. And so that's fine. But I think if he had said this is all true and then he wrote that, then that's a problem. So it's up to it's the writer's responsibility.
Or you can just signal it. I mean, there's a wonderful book called Stalin's Nose by a British travel writer called Rory MacLean. And that opens with a pig falling out of a tree and breaking his uncle's neck. And then you know clearly you're not in the world of New Yorker fact-checkers at this point.
William, my question is to you. In your book, Return of a King, in the acknowledgement section, you have thanked writer Mohsin Hamid for having you stay in his house and for organizing distracting entertainment. So I was just wondering what kind of distracting entertainment you can have in Pakistan these days.
I'm not sure this is a relevant question in front of my wife, but in fact, I'm ashamed to say it was actually the Lahore fashion show, which he took me to. But no, yeah, that was in the travel book anyway, so we'll pass over this question. The front row.
Yeah, I already have a mic.
Who's got the mic? Sorry, at the back.
Go on. Can I quote T.S. Eliot, who said, after all the journeys and travels have been done, all the adventures indulged in, the idea is to come back home or the original place and to see it in a different light. For me, that's a powerful experience. You want to share some stories on that?
Well, as somebody traveling out of America often, I think the beauty of travel is you come back with newly appreciative eyes. Whenever you're at home, I think you're mostly conscious of everything that's going wrong, its insufficiencies, how it's failing to correspond to your notion of the place. As soon as you see your home through foreign eyes, which happens either when you're showing visitors around town or when you travel out and hear people on the far side of the world talk about Jaipur or Mumbai or Delhi, say, you're suddenly jolted into an awareness of all the blessings that you otherwise take for granted. So it's a little different from Eliot's walking along the road and coming to such wisdom that he sees his home with new eyes, but it's an easy way in which we can see our home through foreigners' eyes.
And it's also, I mean, it's not just the return home. I mean, as a travel writer, you actually often take home with you. There's no way when you're on the road or you're out somewhere, you can escape who you are, where you're from, how you've grown up, what kind of values and frameworks you have, and you apply these to the world that you're seeing and the people that you're meeting. So the sense of home, in a sense, even imbues every step of the journey that you take outwards as well as the one that you take back home.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah. So you know how when something funny happens to you, and when you write it down, it's not that funny, and it's just, you know, it sounds lame. So you know, so what? How do you get the?
Are you addressing this particularly to me?
So how?
And is the you know accusatory, or is it a question?
No, it's just you. Anybody, yeah. So how do you get the feeling of the atmosphere in your book or in your writing, so that the reader can feel the same thing as you did when you were there?
I think it's very important for you to keep all your senses open. That when you're describing a place, that you're not just describing how it looks, but how it smells, how your body reacts to it. Does your feet feel the grit in the ground, or in the socks blown in by the dust from the bus, or whatever it is? That you're using taste and senses and hearing as well as vision. You're trying to create a complete picture when you're describing somewhere. And I'm very much sort of aware of, in a sense, of running through a checklist sometimes at the end of a description. Have I got all the senses engaged? Guys?
I would say, imagine you're writing an email to a friend, and whatever you're happening, even if you're describing this session to a friend tonight, you will try to make it as exciting and captivating as possible, even to the point of employing fiction. And the way you convey something to a friend is probably going to work with a stranger too.
I think also read it aloud. You know, when I write, I have to actually be in a room alone, because I'm reading aloud everything I write, and it sounds like I'm a crazy person. I don't want my wife to hear it and my kids, but that's very important to me. I didn't learn that when I first was writing, like in college, but later I realized that's very important, because it kind of separates you a bit from the text, and you start to hear it a bit more of as an outsider.
Particularly if you've got someone you can read it to, it's very good. If you have someone, you immediately spot the errors as you speak it out.
My writing teacher actually reads John McPhee, one of the great writers in America. He has a blind man that he reads everything to, because the guy is such an amazing listener, and he's done this for years, and he's like very, really depends on this guy heavily. Is his wife as well, but he reads everything to that man.
Take another question.
Maybe one last question in the front.
Good afternoon. There's a lovely little post on the Princeton blog written by a guy called Thomas, an American who lived in China, and it says that Peter Hessler single-handedly ruined my life in China. And I'm sure there's a few people who may feel the same way about William and Delhi. And the point that he's making, the point this guy's making is that all of his experiences, whenever he shares them with his friends, they always reply, "Oh yeah, I read that in Peter Hessler." So, do you have a guilty pleasure as great travel writers in rendering the experiences of those of us who follow in your footsteps cliches?
Why is that for me?
Yeah, definitely for you.
I don't understand.
Well, I'll mention first, and then you addressed it. I've actually corresponded with that guy, Tom. He's very nice. So I think actually my mother corresponded with him first, and so I don't know how she found out about that. But it is sort of funny. But when I was teaching, because I wrote a book about teaching in China, and a lot of people teach in China, and they read that book, and a lot of them hate it as a result. And you do hear a lot of negative things. But when I was teaching there, I heard the same thing about Iron and Silk, a really great book by Mark Salzman, and you always heard about. And actually, when I first wrote Rivertown, one of the agents who considered it really wanted me to cut it down into very short vignettes, basically based on Iron and Silk, I could tell. And so I went with another agent, actually, because, so part of it is realizing that there's always space for something else. It has never, I mean, we're so late in the game, as William's introduction made it clear. People have been doing this for a long time. But, you're your own voice, and so I never feel like you're cutting off avenues for everybody else.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll all be signing our books at the back of this space, the Charbagh. But a last round of applause, please, for Peter Hessler, the surprisingly good Akash Kapur, Samanth Subramanian, and Pico Iyer.